Welcome back to Following Noadon, a Stormlight podcast. This week is episode 21, and we are finishing the book this week. This is the entirety of part 5 from chapter 70 all the way through the epilogue and some bits and pieces afterwards as well. What are your 2 words, Eliot, for the end of the book?
My 2 words for the final section of the book are radiance and darkness.
Radiance and darkness. All right. Paul, what are your 2 words?
My 2 words are, so I have violate and reawakened.
Violate and reawakened. Okay.
Yes, we brought some big words this week.
There are some big words here.
Yeah.
All right, let's discuss them. All right, we'll start with you, Eliot. Radiance and darkness. I feel like this is pretty self-explanatory, but walk us through it anyway.
Yeah, it's probably pretty obvious. And I should clarify, when I say radiance, I'm not talking about like knight's radiance, plural or some version of it. It's
okay, with
radiance. Yes, with a CE there at the end of it. So I guess that would still be a noun, but the radiance is describing light, shining through something. But it is related to the Knight's Radiant. We get some good information about the Knight's Radiant. We're starting to learn a little bit more. We get the final scene of the book before the epilogue where Dalinar meets the Almighty, and he tells him basically, you got to restart the Knight's Radiant. And that was cool. That was big. And I picked darkness to kind of be a little bit of a dichotomy to that, because I felt like that was very much the tone of this last section of the book. We had lots of really high, kind of light, bright hero type reveals and things, but then we also had this darkness. We learn who perhaps the ultimate villain is and the darkness that he's getting involved in. And then we get that last scene that I was just talking about with the Almighty, where we see basically the darkness like chewing up Roshar as it just kind of sweeps over it. So this dichotomy of light and darkness, radiance, darkness.
Nice. Paul, tell me about your 2 words.
So mine are a little more separated. So first off, I have violate, and that mostly goes into a lot of the characters' behaviors throughout these chapters, specifically with Shalon and Zeth, where I couldn't come up with a word to perfectly describe it, I guess, but they get as close to violating the norms or their boundaries as they can.
Okay.
And I'll go more into that later. But effectively for them. And then I also have reawakened, which is mostly with the epilogue, and we kind of see a glimpse of a character who's maybe reawoken or a great evil or something.
Mm-hmm.
So big stuff is woken up from long nap, and we'll talk about it. But that's why I chose the word
long nap. Yes, we will talk about it. But before we do, we have a spell check, and it's been a while since we've done one of these. We have 1 word this week, and it is the name, or the name that he gives, I should say, for himself, of the herald in the epilogue. A herald walks up to the gates of Kholinar, which we actually haven't seen yet, and he gives a name. Well, he looks a little distraught. First of all, he's kind of limping and dragging his shard blade, and he gives a name at the gate. Eliot, would you like to say this name?
The syntax, if you will, is a little funky on this name. I don't want to hint anymore for Paul, but I'll take a shot at it. I would guess it's pronounced Talanel Elin.
Okay. So in the audiobook, it's a hard E at the end, at the second half of it. So it's Talanel Elin. not Ellen.
Oh,
So it's
okay.
Talanel Elin is how they say it in the audiobook.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. That makes sense now.
Paul, how would you spell it?
So I still don't know whether or not this is 2 words or 1 word, but regardless, I'm assuming it's
Hold on,
1
hold
if
on.
it's a name.
Before you guess, there was an
Mhm.
apostrophe in Rock's name, so you should use that knowledge.
All right,
No more hints.
that's some good information. Okay, so Talanel Elin, close enough. I went with TALUNEL apostrophe
Okay,
ELEN.
you are very close. So
Ooh.
with your U, it's a E instead, and you were completely perfect. Other than that,
Wow. Okay.
I think you
Close
I think
enough.
you missed a letter at the end too as well. It's ELIN for the second portion there.
Okay. I see. I did have EN at the end. So
But just a
gotcha.
couple vowels off.
yep, just a couple
True, true.
vowels. You're good. Which
And you got that apostrophe, so
it's actually kind of interesting. It's not terribly palindromic. Is palindromic a word? It is now.
it is now.
And like the heralds are supposed to be, the holy gods of the Voran Church, and his name isn't much of a palindrome. So
Interesting.
all right, we will come
I'm
back.
sure Elliot knows why.
Yes,
I have
Elliot.
no idea why.
All right, we will come back to Talanel Elin, and we'll revisit him in the epilogue when we get there. But first of all, let's talk about these Shalon chapters. Let's talk about them all together. It'll be kind of easier that way. We'll talk about 70, 72, and 74. And we have a couple of different reveals, and we'll go through them piece by piece. So the last time we saw Shalon, she had just failed to steal the Soulcaster. She had eaten some poisonous bread and been on her deathbed, quite literally. And Yasna had saved her with what we had assumed to be her Soulcaster that Shalon had stolen. But when Shalon wakes up in this hospital room, she's, feels bad about what she did and spends like 3 hours wallowing in self-pity. But then it dawns on her that Yasna and Eliot, you mentioned this when on the episode that we talked about this earlier, that Yasna ate the bread, and Yasna had told her that the bread was poisoned. So Shalon kind of like sits up in her bed. It's like, wait a minute, that doesn't add up. Why did the jam wasn't there either? Why for her either? Why did she not get poisoned? And the conclusion she comes to is kind of a stretch, honestly. Like, how did she come up with this? That she soulcasted without a soulcaster. That's not a very common, that's not a common thing that people do. So how did she come up with that the soulcaster was fake? But anyway, she concludes the soulcaster is fake and confronts Yasna about it. Any thoughts about this scene?
So yes, this is largely why I chose one of my 2 words, violate.
Okay.
Shalon isn't technically she's not breaking any rules, but she's completely pulling out the stops here. And I don't know how to put it exactly. So she makes these, I guess you could say, wild conclusions about Yasna and what she's been doing, and that she can soulcast without a soulcaster, but she also knows it. It doesn't feel like a jump or a hypothesis. It feels like she knows it, and so she's using this almost as dirt to get more from Yasna,
Right.
and to continue a wordship. And so yeah, I thought that was a very bold move, So
When
shout out to Shalon.
when we last saw Shalon, I asked you guys, does Shalon have any future with Yasna? And both of you assumed, well, no, she can't, right? She just stole a soulcaster. That's worth going to war over, and Yasna could put her in prison, as she says in this episode. But here we are. The next chapter we see her, and she blackmails Yasuno into keeping her on as a pupil. Well, it's not quite that dramatic, but it is in a way.
It kind of is, yeah. It doesn't feel incredibly menacing. The blackmail aspect, it's like, like this doesn't have to become a big deal if I just get to keep learning with you and stuff
Right.
like that. So it is like blackmail, but it's not that major. You can just feel the passion with Shalon there, and that she is dying to know more. And we learn a lot more in these chapters, which I thought was super cool. Specifically about, well, we learned about Shadesmar, which was super cool at the very start there. And yeah, I don't know if Elliot has any more thoughts before I go into that. But I was curious to talk about that.
All I'll say is my takeaway from this first start was Shalon is a heck of a lot smarter than I am, because she noticed that Yasna ate the bread just like we did, but she was able to make a lot more conclusions than we were about what happened. And just by like sitting there and playing the events kind of back through her mind, she was able to puzzle it out. She had maybe a couple of extra bits of information that we did. I think she talked, or she specifically realized that in her drawing of Yasna, the bread is like melting in her hand or something like that. It's visibly deformed. We didn't have that clue, in our defense, when we were trying to figure this out before. But now that I think back on it, this is clearly a good explanation for what went down that we really couldn't figure out. But Shalon is persistent. Shalon is very, very persistent. Yasna can soulcast without a soulcaster, and we don't quite know how that works. She hints at it in a later chapter. We'll talk about in a second. But does she still require Sphere's Stormlight to do it? Because when she went to soulcast Shalon's blood, she was like urgently asking for a garnet. She's like, somebody bring me a garnet, which I know from looking in the Arcanum in the back that the garnet is the gem that's like aligned with blood. And so was she asking for that as a farce, or like to try and disguise what she's doing, or does she still need to have Stormlight of a certain kind to do it? Do we know?
So from a rereader's perspective, it's pretty easy for me to piece this together, but this isn't spoiling anything if I just explain this. That she's asking for a garnet to cover up that she can soulcast without it, because she's pulling out her Fabrial, her
right,
her soulcaster, and she needs a garnet to soulcast her blood if she was going to use the soulcaster, because that's how soulcasters work.
Right.
But that's not how her soulcasting works. So she was deliberately asking for a garnet to put in her soulcaster to pretend that she's using the soulcaster, but all she needs is Stormlight of any kind to soulcast for her own.
But she does need Stormlight.
She does need Stormlight, just like Kaladin needs Stormlight for his Surge Binding.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Now we can talk about Shadesmar.
Alrighty.
That is interesting. I have one thing to note here.
Sure.
As we go into Shadesmar. So I think it's really interesting how we've seen throughout the book, it's like everything is powered by Stormlight.
Mm-hmm.
Basically absolutely everything mythical, at least, all the shard blades and plate, things like that, and the surge binders, etc. But what I thought was interesting as we kind of look into Shadesmar and how Shalon gets there is it's fueled by like an abstract thing. It's fueled by this like revealing of a secret, which is really weird to me. Don't know if y'all have any thoughts about that. It's like the more powerful the secret, the more effective.
So here's how I can explain this so far, and you'll learn a little bit about this pretty soon when we talk about the Knights Radiant quiz. We'll have a special thing about that in a little bit, but each of the orders of Knights Radiant have a different way that they progress. So Sylphrena requires Kaladin to tell him a promise. The words, I will. What are the words? I keep hesitating on what the second ideal is because I don't want to accidentally spoil something. I believe it's I will protect those who cannot protect themselves.
Yep.
So Kaladin is giving Syl an oath, or whoever's asking for the words, he's giving them an oath. And Shalon is giving the symbol head Spren a truth. So these different orders of the Knights Radiant progress differently, and it really just depends on which order you're in on how you progress and how you thrive. Does that make sense?
Yes. Somewhat.
It does, and it's awakening a lot of thoughts in my brain here. I hadn't realized that the words that Kaladin was saying were an oath. That makes a lot of sense now,
Right.
actually, that Kaladin, in tandem with his honor spren, he's making these oaths and, like you said, progressing and growing in his powers.
Right.
We learn later on in one of these other Shalon chapters, Shalon asks about the symbol heads. She's like, "What are they?" And Yasna says, "I'll explain later, but for now they're just spren." And my guess at what kind of spren was actually that they are truth spren, because they demand of her a truth, is what they say. You have to tell me a truth. And so that's interesting. Maybe Shalon is progressing in her powers by sharing honest, truths or secrets, like you said, Paul, with these truth spren. Are they her Syl, like Kaladin has? Now the wheels in my brain are turning.
So here's another tidbit for you. As Kaladin's progressed through this book, he's been accidentally surge binding. He's been like doing it just as an instinct, if you will, a habit, and not like actively doing it. But as soon as he requires it to save the Bridgeman on like an intentional thing of I need Stormlight because I am completely exhausted, he needs to say the words to have him level up, if you will, to use it better. And then Shalon has accidentally gone to Shadesmar before. When she soulcast the goblet to blood on accident, she accidentally went to Shadesmar. So now when she's trying to intentionally go to Shadesmar, intentionally use her powers, the Spren ask her for a truth so that she can progress and then intentionally use her powers. Does that make sense? That both Shalon and Kaladin are kind of progressing here. We've seen more of Kaladin, obviously, but next book is Shalon's book, so we'll get to see more Shalon.
That is interesting. Okay, and just to make sure I understood it right from what you were saying, Trevor. So, Kaladin saying the words as a promise, right? It was those words of, I'll protect those who can't protect themselves.
Right.
I believe I was probably a little off.
Nope, that was right.
Okay, awesome. So, if that is, I guess, correlated with his connection with Syl, the Bond Spren, and then we have Shalon with the Truth Spren, right? I'm wondering
As you're calling them now, they might not be, but yes.
Yes, for now, the symbol heads, the Truth Spren.
Sure.
So you said that those were like, did you say that those were correspondent to a group of the Nice Radiant?
Yes.
Each? Okay. And so now I'm curious, with Zeth, with his Oathstone, that's got to be like his form of it, right? There's got to be some kind of Oath Spren or something like that. That's what's keeping him bound to that Oathstone.
Okay.
Don't know the exact specifics on that. But there's got to be something, right? Because he's definitely a huge part of that.
So do you think that Zeth and Kaladin are in the same order because they have some of the same powers? And they both have oaths?
No, they're definitely not in the same thing because this oath stone is just too big and ominous, and it's too different from what Kaladin has. Yes, they do have similar powers. Awesome. But I would expect that each Order of the Knights Radiant would have this at least similar powers.
Okay.
To an extent, at least some have some similarities. So I believe theirs would be similar, but not the same.
Eliot, any guesses?
I feel like Kaladin and Zeth probably are in the same order. I mean, I agree that Zeth kind of handles his honor differently than Kaladin does, and he has an object, an oath stone, as opposed to a spren. We don't really know what Zeth's relationship with his spren is at this point, but the way they kind of treat it, focusing around oaths and honor and all of that seems to be similar enough to make me think that they are in the same. Maybe Zeth's spren talks to him and Zeth just thinks it's his oath stone talking to him when in reality it's his honor spren that's talking to him. I don't know, maybe. I don't know if we have enough information yet, but I would probably lean towards them being along the same path.
Can I give you some more information in the book?
Always.
So
no.
I don't know how much you guys actually looked at the Ars Arcanum in the back, which is just some notes on some rules and fabrials and stuff. But
I'm gonna look at it.
It's almost literally on the last page of the book, and it says, "Windrunning and lashings. Reports of the assassin in White's odd abilities had led me to some sources of information that, I believe, are generally unknown. The Windrunners were on Order of Knights Radiant, and they made use of two primary types of surge binding. The effects of these surge bindings were known, colloquially, among the members of the Order as the three lashings." It goes on to explain the basic lashings, the full lashings, and the reverse lashings, as we've seen previous. And Eliot, you've assumed that Kaladin has been using these lashings, and Zeth certainly has been using these lashings. He's been naming them as he's using them. He knows what they are. But Kaladin doesn't. So Kaladin doesn't know what he can do. But he's using a lot of the same powers that Zeth is, but Zeth is naming them. So any thoughts on this?
If the lashings truly are unique to one Order of the Knights Radiant, that seems like a lot of evidence that they're the same. But and perhaps that we get a name for their order right here in that they're both Windrunners. But I'd like to point out that we are trusting this Ars Arcanum at the back of the book for some information.
Sure.
I've learned not to necessarily trust everything we read so far. So that is definitely a good bit of evidence there for sure.
I was going to save that for the end of the episode, but it tied in really nicely there, so I was just throwing it in there.
Dude, there's no way that. Actually, I'm not going to say there's no way, but I'm still mentally convinced that Kaladin and Zeth are not in the same order.
All right, we can go forward with those two predictions that Eliot thinks they are both Windrunners, and Paul thinks they're not. Do you think one of them is Windrunner? And if so, which one?
So, from how we know Kaladin as being storm blessed and all his comparison to wind and such, I don't think he is. And that is also going off of this, so maybe
it's not what I thought you were going to say leading into that.
Got him. So maybe I'm kind of playing myself here because I'm looking at the Ars Arcanum to make this decision, but I'm specifically saying that it's not right because they're not the same. Mostly just because it mentions the assassin, reports of the assassin in White's odd abilities and etc. about wind running and lashings. So that makes me think it's Zeth,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not entirely sure.
But who knows, right?
Yeah.
All right, so let's tie this right into Zeth's chapter. We'll come back to Shalon. Zeth, we get a full chapter for Zeth. I assumed that Paul would be very excited about this. And we find him in Kharbranth, which is where Yasna and Shalon are. And
I'd like to point out too that this is the first time I think that we've seen Zeth not killing at least one person or many multiples of persons.
Mm-hmm.
Fair. Okay.
Peaceful Zeth.
Yep. And he was there to kill Taravangian, but as it turns out, he wasn't actually there to kill Taravangian. Any thoughts on this chapter? Someone want to take this reveal and run with it?
Yes, a little bit. So, so part of my word violate was we see Zeth almost come to his limit of breaking his oath. He specifically, you see his thought process of, I could just kill him, like talking about Taravangian after he finds out. And that was part of why I chose that word. That is a little ahead, but I did want to talk about earlier, just simply to admire the awesome imagery that I got whenever Zeth is approaching Taravangian. It talks about with all the lashings, he makes a rock weightless and then makes himself weigh 1/10 of his normal weight. He just kind of floats down on this rock.
Yep.
And I thought that was so cool. I was like, that is sick. I don't know if either of y'all did the math on how to get yourself to weigh 1/10. I didn't bother. After all the confusion with a quarter lashing up makes you weigh half.
Yeah.
You know, all that jazz.
But you know there's a good bit of the score going, the musical score going when Zeth is just like slowly, sinking down below the floor and into the room below.
Exactly, yeah. I can like picture that scene super well. And then he starts to form his shard blade and he starts speaking, and then Taravangian kind of turns the tables on him, which was really interesting. We
Surprise!
haven't seen him get into anything like this before. So
I was pretty caught off guard by this this reveal, this plot twist, if you will. I would never have guessed in 1,000 years that Taravangian was the one controlling Zeth. I probably would have guessed that Taravangian is a lot more than he seemed. I probably would have guessed that I could easily see him becoming a much bigger character in the future. I could see him being, key to events later on, much more so than we've seen him so far. But for that super nice old guy to be this incredible villain who is responsible for the murders of many, many people, like, whoa.
So yes, I agree with you, Elliot. It really caught me off guard when I was a first-time reader of The Way of Kings, and I listened to this episode. I remember thinking, no way, like that is insane, to the point where I missed the second half of the chapter. I was so blown away that Taravangian was in charge of Zeth and his Oathstone that I completely missed the hidden hospital part of the chapter. And I don't want you guys to miss it. I don't know if you guys kind of did the same thing, that you were so blown away by Taravangian being behind Zeth that you kind of missed the second part of the chapter. But we learn that Taravangian, in this secret hospital that's not in any, it's like a secret room, and it's a huge room. It's got hundreds of beds with sick people in it, and they're recording what their dying people are saying. And I'm not sure if you guys have put this together, but let me read this for you. So here's a quote from the chapter 71, which the Zeth chapter that we're in. Taravangian led Zeth to an alcove of beds, each with a sickly person in it. There were healers working on them. doing something to their arms, draining their blood. A woman with a writing clipboard stood near the beds, pen held, waiting for something. What? I don't understand, Zeth said, watching in horror as the 4 patients grew pale. You're killing them, aren't you? Yes. A little bit further. On the beds, a dying youth started speaking. One of the women with the clipboard stepped forward quickly, recording the words. The day was ours, but they took it, the boy cried. Stormfather, you cannot have it. The day is ours. They come, rasping, and the lights fail. O Stormfather, the boy arched his back, then fell still suddenly, eyes dead. The king turned to Zeth. It is better for one man to sin than for a people to be destroyed, wouldn't you say, Zeth's son Valano? Any initial thoughts on that before I move on to something else I'm about to read? Just like quick 15-second reaction.
So my reaction at that was we have found the source of our epigraphs.
Correct.
Up until now, we've had the epigraphs where clearly it's the words of dying people. They're all marked, 12 seconds pre-death, 20 seconds pre-death, along with a date, and then given like a sample number. So all of that fits very nicely into what we just witnessed with a very medical or scientific approach to collecting the words of the death, or words of the dying, and even bringing in shipments of people so that we can kill them and gather their words.
Correct. Way back in chapter 1, the epigraph in front of chapter 1, we have, "You've killed me. Bastards, you've killed me. While the sun is still hot, I die. Collected on the 5th day of the week Chach of the month Beteb of the year 1171, 10 seconds before death. Subject was a dark-eyed soldier, 31 years of age. Sample is considered questionable." And then, if you shuffle to the end note, at the very end of the end note, we have another similar epigraph all the way at the end of the book. I'll read it more later because I'll talk about this end note further. But Joshua, head of His Majesty's Silent Gatherers, Tentatev, 1173. So this is what I want to point out here. This has been happening a long time. They have been collecting these dead people's words as they die for quite a while. And in the chapter, they say that it started happening about 7 years ago when Gavilar was exploring the Shattered Plains. People started saying weird things as they die. And they started collecting them in 1171. So Taravangian and his silent gatherers, as they're called, have been killing people for at least 2 years to write down things that they think they see on the other side. I completely missed that on my first read through the book. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't pick that up at all. I had no idea how long this is going for. The context seemed to make it seem like it'd been going on for a while. I mean, Taravangian, like you said, did talk about we've started seeing these, 7 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever it is. So I just kind of assume this has been going on for a while. But yeah, those dates are very, very helpful to wrap my mind around this. This is a very systematic murder of a lot of people.
Any thoughts? Really? I have so many. I did not notice this at all until y'all just pointed it out. I did not know that was the connection to the epigraphs, and so I'm kind of floored at the moment, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah.
This is huge. I don't fully know what to make of it right now.
So, do you remember that even as far back as the Young Kaladin chapters, Kharbranth is known as the City of Bells and the City of Hospitals. If you are sick, you go to Kharbranth. because they have the best surgeons, and Kaladin was going to go to Kharbranth to study. Now we know that they've been secretly killing their dying and sometimes shipping in people that are not going to die and going to kill them because the secret can't get out. That I was shook when I realized this. I think it was my second read through.
Yeah. I absolutely crazy. This basically gives everything more perspective and kind of more what the heck is going on here. Because also, side note, I just got my physical copy of the book today, so I'm gonna try and look through this and see all these like starting epigraphs. There's just so much. I'm a little overwhelmed. Someone take the floor.
So when we got this reveal with Taravangian, and it starts to dawn on you as a reader just the magnitude of what he's doing here, and how unquestionably evil he apparently is. My first thing I'm trying to figure out is, okay, what's the motive? Because anytime you come across a villain, I immediately look for, okay, what's their driving force? No, typically no one is pure evil. They view themselves as some sort of a hero.
Right.
And so trying to figure out, unless they're purely insane, you occasionally get like the, I've lost my mind kind of villain. Taravangian is clearly not that. Although maybe that, I don't know. We'll see. But I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's his thought process? And he kind of spells it out for you, but it's a little bit difficult to decipher. He thinks that he is going to save the world with this. He thinks that these little bits that people are spouting when they die, as these are the clues that we are going to need to defend ourselves against, I guess we assume, the last desolation. I don't know that does he say last desolation? I don't remember.
He doesn't.
Yeah, I didn't think so. But clearly that's the apocalypse that's coming in the future.
Sure.
So he's trying to protect against it by gathering as much of this information as he can. And he has an interesting discussion with Zeth, where he says, you and I are not that different. I am choosing to do this terrible thing in order to save the world. I think Zeth even says at a point, you're a monster.
Mm-hmm.
And Taravangian says, yep, you're right, I am. But I will be the monster so that I can save the world and no one else has to be, which is kind of what Zeth is. And we get a little bit of hints as Zeth is going through this of perhaps that is Zeth's true punishment. That's what he's been sent to do because of whatever he did, which we don't know, is that his punishment is he has to bear the sins of others. People are going to use him to do these terrible things. And Zeth talks about how it's not his fault. It still is his fault. He's responsible for the things that he's doing, but he still has to do them anyway. That's his punishment for being truthless. And Taravangian kind of views himself in a similar way. I have to do this terrible thing to save the world. Yes, it's terrible, but I'm going to do it. And yeah, that was a lot of rambling thoughts without a conclusion, but that's me trying to process what Taravangian is trying to do here.
Here's something we can conclude for this chapter. Who's the villain? Is it Taravangian? Is it Zeth? Is it Sadeas? Who's the villain?
Is it Shalon?
Is it Shalon?
My answer to that is the immediate villain, the antagonist for the Way of Kings, I think is Sadeas. I think he's the one you interact with the most. He's the force that our protagonists are working against for the majority of the book. There's a couple other villains. Cabsol probably gets thrown in the villain category. But then when you look at the bigger scale, okay, who's the ultimate villain? Who's the behind the scenes, working to the most evil end? That seems to be Taravangian. So I'm assuming Taravangian is going to become a more relevant villain in the future, but he is maybe the ultimate villain here, whereas Sadeas is the more immediate villain.
But what if he's doing what he's doing to prevent the desolation from Odium?
That's what I was about to say.
Does that still make him a villain?
So I was gonna say we don't like Teravangian a whole lot,
Not right now.
but we don't really understand what he's working against. And I think what he's working against is probably the huge villain here. I was going to say my guess as to the ultimate antagonist. I entirely agree with Eliot that for this book, Sadeas was the antagonist. He was the bad guy that we don't like. But the ultimate antagonist, I think, has more to do with the Voidbringers, which I wanted to go back to that with Shalon.
Yep, we can do that.
As well as stuff with the epilogue and our.
But before we leave Teravangian, are you about to move on? Because I have a thought real quick.
Yes, go right ahead.
So before we leave Teravangian, what I will say is, have y'all learned nothing from the Way of Kings? Not this Way of Kings, but the Way of Kings that Dalinar is reading. Because if we go look at the morals that Dalinar is studying and the whole journey before destination and the whole means to an end type of assessment of honor and doing the right thing, that code clearly, I think, says from what we've learned that the means do not justify the end. And so what you're doing matters just as much as where you're going. And so if you kind of apply that process, that measurement stick to Teravangian, then he's clearly in the evil category for me. Of he may have an ultimate goal that he thinks is good and may even be good. And at the end of the day, maybe even what he's doing is the way to save Roshar. But if he's gonna murder so many people to get there, the question becomes, was it even worth it? And is he sacrificing the journey in favor of the destination? So that's you're right. We don't know a ton about Teravangian yet, and I probably shouldn't judge him quite yet, although this was a pretty dark reveal for him. But I would immediately apply that comparison to him and pretty quickly throw him in the nope, no excuse for that.
And at this point, you're kind of supposed to be throwing him there, so that's not completely out of the blue. I'm giving you more than the first reader usually picks up here, so.
Yeah, I agree with Eliot though. You're like right now, Teravangian is bad. He's probably the worst person we know of. Although I am curious about, like I said before, we see a correlation in the Shalon chapters